On the morning of March 12, 1985, a plumber named Michael Brennan cut through a wall in the basement of a townhouse on Tunlaw Road in northwest Washington, D.C., and found something that should not have been there. Behind the plaster and wooden frame, running vertically through the cavity like veins in a body, were cables, thin, professional cables, wrapped in Soviet-grade insulation, connected to junction boxes that had no business existing in an American home. He stood there for several seconds, holding his reciprocating saw, staring at what looked like the nervous system of a building that had been watching and listening for years. The house was silent. The owners were at work, and Michael Brennan, a 38-year-old union plumber with a mortgage and 2 kids in public school, realized he was looking at something that could get him killed. He did not touch the cables. He did not take a photograph. He walked upstairs, locked his toolbox, got into his van, and drove directly to a payphone 3 blocks away. He called a number he had been given years earlier by a man who said he worked for the State Department, but carried himself like someone who did not. The man had told him, in a bar after a job at the Soviet Embassy Annex in 1979, that if he ever saw anything unusual while working in certain neighborhoods, he should call. Michael had laughed it off at the time. He was not political. He fixed pipes, but he had kept the card in his wallet, folded behind his driver's license, just in case. Now, standing in a phone booth on Wisconsin Avenue with rain starting to fall, he dialed the number and said only this: "I found something. Tunlaw Road. You need to see it." Within 2 hours, 3 men in gray suits arrived at the house. They did not knock. They had a key. Michael was told to wait outside while they went down into the basement. He sat in his van, smoking a cigarette he had not planned to buy, watching the front door. He thought about his wife, Karen, who worked as a secretary at Georgetown University. He thought about his daughter, Emily, who was 10 and wanted to be a veterinarian. He thought about his son, David, who was 7 and collected baseball cards. He thought about how normal his life had been that morning, and how it might never be normal again. When the men came out, one of them walked over to the van and leaned against the door. He was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too many basements like this one. "You did the right thing," the man said. "We're going to need you to forget you were here today. The work order will be closed. You'll be paid in full. If anyone asks, the leak was behind a different wall, and you fixed it. Do you understand?" Michael nodded. He wanted to ask questions. He wanted to know what those cables were for, how long they had been there, who had put them there. But the man's face told him that asking would be a mistake. So he drove home, ate dinner with his family, helped his son with his math homework, and said nothing. That night, lying in bed next to Karen, he stared at the ceiling and wondered how many other houses in Washington had wires behind their walls. He wondered who was listening. He wondered if anyone was listening to him. What Michael Brennan had found was not an isolated anomaly. It was part of a system that had been built quietly, methodically, and invisibly over the course of more than a decade. The house on Tunlaw Road belonged to a mid-level analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency. The man's name was Richard Kowalski, and he had no idea that every conversation he had ever had in his own home had been recorded, transcribed, and filed in a basement archive 3,000 miles away in Moscow. He did not know that the walls were alive. He did not know that his privacy had been sold years before he ever moved in, by people who understood that in Washington, information was the only currency that mattered. The year was 1985, and the Cold War had become a war of silence. There were no tanks rolling through streets, no bombs falling from the sky. The violence was bureaucratic, technical, and absolute. It happened in locked rooms, in encrypted cables, in the narrow space between what people said and what they meant. The Soviet Union and the United States had spent 40 years building an architecture of mutual destruction so vast and so precise that both sides understood the only way to survive was to know everything about the other. Knowledge was deterrence. Ignorance was suicide. And so they listened. They listened to phone calls, to radio transmissions, to the hum of air conditioners and the vibration of typewriters. They planted microphones in walls, in lamps, in the gifts exchanged between diplomats. They turned cities into recording studios and citizens into unknowing actors in a play that never ended. Washington, D.C. in the mid-1980s was a city of secrets wearing the mask of a democracy. On the surface, it functioned like any other American metropolis. People commuted to work, paid their taxes, sent their children to school, and believed in the fundamental decency of their government. But beneath that surface was a second city, invisible and parallel, where trust was a liability and everyone was a potential asset. The Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue was surrounded by surveillance equipment so sophisticated that the FBI could hear a conversation through a window from 200 yards away. The CIA headquarters in Langley had entire floors dedicated to analyzing the garbage collected from Soviet diplomatic residences. And somewhere in between, in the ordinary homes of ordinary people who worked in offices with security clearances, were the hidden wires that made the whole system possible. The technology was not exotic. It did not require satellites or supercomputers. The cables Michael Brennan found in that basement were standard telecommunication lines, the kind used by phone companies across the country. What made them dangerous was where they led. The junction boxes were designed to intercept and duplicate signals without disrupting the original flow of electricity. A phone call made from the house would travel through the wall, split at the junction, and send a copy down a separate line that ran underground, through the city's utility tunnels, and eventually to a listening post operated by officers of the KGB's First Chief Directorate. The original call would continue uninterrupted. The speaker would never know. The system was elegant, deniable, and almost impossible to detect unless someone physically opened the wall. This was the genius of Soviet technical intelligence during the Cold War. It did not rely on dramatic infiltrations or Hollywood-style espionage. It relied on patience, access, and the fundamental truth that Americans, like all people, talked. They talked about their work, their frustrations, their fears. They complained about their bosses. They gossiped about their colleagues. They mentioned things they should not have mentioned, in places they believed were safe. And in doing so, they gave away pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled over months and years, revealed the shape of American policy, the location of military assets, and the vulnerabilities of the intelligence community. The man who lived in the house on Tunlaw Road had never said anything classified over his home phone. But he had said enough. He had mentioned names. He had mentioned travel schedules. He had described in passing the mood in certain meetings. And all of it had been written down. Michael Brennan was not the first plumber to find something he should not have found. Over the years, electricians, carpenters, and building inspectors across Washington had stumbled upon similar installations. Most of them did not report it. Some did not recognize what they were looking at. Others convinced themselves it was a mistake, a relic from an old security system, something that had nothing to do with them. A few called the police and were told to forget about it. One man, a heating contractor named Gerald Moss, found a microphone embedded in the ductwork of a row house in DuPont Circle in 1982. He took it to the FBI field office on 4th Street and was debriefed for 6 hours. He was told it was part of an ongoing investigation. He was told not to speak to anyone, including his wife. He was told that his cooperation was a matter of national security. 2 weeks later, he was audited by the IRS. The audit found no irregularities, but the message was clear. Silence was the price of normalcy. This was how the system protected itself. Not through violence, but through the quiet application of pressure. The men and women who discovered the surveillance infrastructure were not disappeared or imprisoned. They were reminded, gently but unmistakably, that their lives depended on discretion. And so they stayed silent. They went back to work. They told themselves that someone else was handling it, that the professionals knew what they were doing, that it was better not to know, and the wires stayed in the walls. By the time Michael Brennan made his discovery, the scope of Soviet electronic surveillance in Washington was staggering. The KGB had spent nearly 2 decades building a network of listening posts, safe houses, and signal interception points throughout the city. Some of the operations were run directly from the embassy. Others were managed by illegals, Soviet intelligence officers living under deep cover with false identities, who posed as businessmen, academics, or tradesmen. These officers rented apartments in strategic locations, purchased properties through shell companies, and quietly installed the equipment necessary to monitor the communications of targets who would never suspect they were being watched. The targets were not always high-ranking officials. Often they were mid-level analysts, secretaries, or technical staff who had access to information but lacked the training to recognize when they were being exploited. The house on Tunlaw Road had been compromised in 1978, 2 years before Richard Kowalski moved in. The previous owner had been a consultant for the Department of Energy, a man named Eugene Harkness, who had worked on nuclear waste disposal policy. Harkness had sold the house after accepting a position in California, and the sale had been handled by a real estate agent who was, unbeknownst to anyone involved, an asset of the KGB. The agent had arranged for a brief period between the sale and the new owner's move-in date, during which a team of technical specialists had entered the property and installed the surveillance system. The work had taken less than 48 hours. The walls were opened, the cables were run, the junction boxes were hidden, and the plaster was repaired so skillfully that no one would ever notice unless they were looking for it. When Richard Kowalski moved in with his wife and 2 children, the house was already alive. For 7 years, every word spoken in that house had been captured. Birthday parties, arguments, late-night phone calls to parents, conversations about work that should have stayed at the office. Richard Kowalski was a careful man. He understood operational security. He never brought classified documents home. He never discussed sensitive programs over the phone. But he was also human. He was tired. He talked to his wife about the stress of his job. He mentioned the names of colleagues. He described in vague terms the projects he was working on. And from those fragments, the analysts in Moscow built a profile. They knew his routines. They knew his weaknesses. They knew when he was most vulnerable. And if they had ever needed to recruit him, they would have known exactly how to do it. Michael Brennan did not know any of this. He only knew that he had seen something wrong, and that he had done what he thought was right. But in the days after the discovery, he began to feel the weight of what he had stepped into. He noticed things he had not noticed before. A car parked across the street from his house for 3 consecutive evenings. A man in a dark coat standing near the bus stop where his daughter waited after school. Phone calls where no one spoke on the other end. He told himself it was paranoia. He told himself he was imagining things. But he also started locking his doors at night, and he stopped talking about his work, even to Karen. When she asked him what was wrong, he said he was tired. When she asked him if something had happened, he said no. And he knew, as he said it, that he was lying to protect her. The truth was that Michael Brennan had become a problem the moment he made that phone call. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had seen something that revealed the scope of a failure. The men in gray suits who arrived at the house on Tunlaw Road were not there to thank him. They were there to contain the damage. The existence of Soviet surveillance equipment in the home of a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst was not just an intelligence breach. It was evidence of a systemic vulnerability that had gone undetected for years. It meant that other houses were compromised. It meant that other analysts had been talking into walls that were listening. It meant that somewhere in the chain of security clearances, background checks, and counterintelligence protocols, something had broken down, and the people responsible for that system could not afford for the story to spread. Within a week of the discovery, a team from the FBI's Washington field office began a quiet operation to identify and dismantle other surveillance installations in the area. They did not announce it. They did not seek warrants. They operated under the authority of a classified presidential directive that allowed for warrantless searches in cases involving foreign intelligence threats on American soil. Over the course of 3 months, they found 17 additional properties with similar systems. Some were homes, Others were apartments near government buildings, rented by individuals who had no idea their landlords were working for Moscow. The equipment was always the same: professional-grade telecommunication cables, junction boxes designed to split and duplicate signals, and lines that ran through utility tunnels to listening posts scattered throughout the city. The operation was given a code name that was never made public. The findings were compiled in a report that was classified at a level so high that even most members of the Senate Intelligence Committee were not allowed to read it. Richard Kowalski was never told that his house had been bugged. The decision was made at a level above the field agents who conducted the sweep. The reasoning was simple. If Kowalski knew, he would ask questions. He would want to know how long it had been there, what had been recorded, and whether his career had been compromised. Those questions would lead to internal investigations, to leaks, and eventually to public scrutiny. The men who made these decisions understood that the appearance of control was sometimes more important than control itself. So Kowalski was told only that his home had been inspected as part of a routine security review and that no issues had been found. He believed them. He had no reason not to, and he continued living in that house for another 3 years, never knowing that the walls had been opened, the cables removed, and the evidence erased as if it had never existed. Michael Brennan was not so fortunate. 2 months after the discovery, he was approached by a man who identified himself as a liaison from the Office of Security at the State Department. The man was polite, professional, and direct. He explained that Michael's cooperation had been valuable and that the government was grateful. He also explained that Michael's security clearance, which he did not know he had, was being reviewed. Michael said he had never applied for a security clearance. The man smiled and said that sometimes clearances were granted administratively, as a precaution, to individuals who worked in sensitive locations. Michael asked what that meant. The man said it meant that Michael had done work at the Soviet Embassy Annex, at the residence of a foreign diplomat, and at several other locations that required a background check. Michael did not remember signing anything. The man said the paperwork was handled through his union, and then the man said something that made Michael's stomach tighten. The review found some inconsistencies, nothing serious, but enough that we need to ask you a few questions. The questions came in a windowless room in a government building on E Street. There were 2 men this time, both younger, both wearing ties that looked like they had been issued from the same closet. They asked Michael about his finances. They asked about his travel history. They asked if he had ever been contacted by a foreign national. They asked if he had ever been offered money for information. Michael said no to everything. He was telling the truth. But the way they looked at him made him feel like he was lying. They asked about his wife's family. They asked if anyone in his extended family had immigrated from Eastern Europe. Michael said his grandfather had come from Poland in 1923. They wrote that down. They asked if he had ever visited Poland. He said no. They asked if he had ever wanted to. He said he had not thought about it. They looked at each other. One of them closed his notebook. The other one leaned back in his chair and said, "We appreciate your time, Mr. Brennan. We'll be in touch." Michael never heard from them again. But the damage was done. Within 6 months, his union contracts began to dry up. The jobs he had relied on for years, the steady work at government buildings and diplomatic residences, were no longer being assigned to him. When he asked his shop steward what was happening, the man looked uncomfortable and said only that the client list had changed. Michael knew what that meant. He had been flagged, not arrested, not accused, but marked as someone who had seen too much and could not be trusted to stay silent. He tried to find work elsewhere, but word traveled in his industry. By the end of 1986, he was doing residential repairs in Maryland and Virginia, working for cash, taking jobs that paid half of what he used to make. Karen asked him what had happened. He told her the economy was bad. She did not believe him, but she did not push. She had learned, over the years of their marriage, that there were things Michael did not talk about. This was one of them. The surveillance network that Michael Brennan had uncovered was not the work of a single operation. It was the product of a doctrine that had been refined over decades, born from the Soviet understanding that intelligence was not about dramatic coups or stolen blueprints. It was about access, patience, and the slow accumulation of details that, individually, meant nothing, but collectively revealed everything. The KGB had learned, through painful experience in the 1950s and 1960s, that recruiting high-level American officials was difficult, dangerous, and often counterproductive. Defectors were unreliable, moles were paranoid. And the FBI's counterintelligence operations had become sophisticated enough that anyone who approached a Soviet officer was immediately suspect. So the KGB adapted. Instead of trying to turn people, they decided to simply listen to them. The technical intelligence operations in Washington were managed by Line N of the KGB's First Chief Directorate, a unit that specialized in illegal support and covert infrastructure. Line N officers did not meet with agents or handle classified documents. Their job was to create the conditions under which intelligence could be collected passively, without human contact. They rented apartments. They purchased properties through front companies. They bribed building inspectors and utility workers. They mapped the city's underground infrastructure, identifying the routes that telecommunication cables took from government buildings to central switching stations. And they installed equipment that allowed them to intercept those signals without ever needing to set foot inside a secure facility. The beauty of the system was its invisibility. There were no dead drops, no secret meetings, no moments of vulnerability where an officer could be caught in the act. The intelligence simply flowed, like water through pipes, and the people being monitored never knew. The listening posts themselves were scattered throughout the city, hidden in plain sight. Some were in the basements of apartment buildings owned by Soviet shell companies. Others were in commercial properties leased under false names. One of the most productive posts was located in a row house in Cleveland Park, less than 2 miles from the National Cathedral. The house was owned by a man named Viktor Petrov, who presented himself as an art dealer specializing in Eastern European antiquities. He had lived in Washington since 1976, spoke fluent English with a slight accent, and was known in the neighborhood as a quiet, cultured man who kept to himself. His neighbors had no idea that the basement of his house contained recording equipment capable of monitoring more than 40 separate telecommunication lines simultaneously. Every night, Petrov would descend into that basement and transfer the day's recordings onto magnetic tapes, which were then couriered to the Soviet embassy in diplomatic pouches that were immune to search under international law. The tapes were flown to Moscow on Aeroflot flights, analyzed by teams of linguists and analysts, and filed in archives that would not be opened for decades. Viktor Petrov was not his real name. He was an illegal, a deep cover officer who had been trained for years before being sent to the United States. He had a Canadian passport, a fabricated personal history, and a legend that had been carefully constructed to withstand scrutiny. He paid his taxes. He attended community events. He donated to local charities. He did everything a normal person would do because normalcy was the best cover. And for 9 years, he successfully operated one of the most valuable intelligence assets the KGB had ever placed on American soil. He was never caught. In 1987, he quietly closed his business, sold his house, and returned to Canada, where he lived under a different name until his death in 2003. The FBI did not learn of his true identity until after the fall of the Soviet Union, when a defector provided a list of illegals who had operated in the United States during the Cold War. By then, it was too late to prosecute him. The house in Cleveland Park had been sold 3 times. The new owners had renovated the basement. The tapes were still in Moscow. The system that Viktor Petrov and others like him had built was not destroyed by Michael Brennan's discovery. It was damaged, certainly. The FBI's sweep of compromised properties forced the KGB to abandon some of its listening posts and relocate others, but the underlying logic of the operation remained intact. As long as there were walls, there would be places to hide. As long as there were cables, there would be ways to listen. And as long as people believed they were safe in their own homes, they would continue to talk. The Cold War had taught both sides a fundamental lesson. Privacy was an illusion. The only question was who was paying attention. Richard Kowalski retired from the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1993, 2 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He moved to Florida with his wife, bought a small house near the coast, and spent his remaining years fishing and playing golf. He died in 2011, never knowing that for 7 years of his life, every word he had spoken in his home had been recorded and analyzed by a foreign intelligence service. His obituary in the local newspaper described him as a dedicated public servant who had worked tirelessly to protect his country. It did not mention that his country had failed to protect him. Michael Brennan continued working as a plumber until 2002, when a back injury forced him into early retirement. He and Karen moved to Pennsylvania to be closer to their daughter, who had become a veterinarian, just as she had always wanted. Michael never spoke about what he had found in that basement on Tunlaw Road. He never told his children. He never told his friends. He carried it silently, the way men of his generation carried most things. In 2019, a journalist researching Cold War surveillance operations contacted him after finding his name in a declassified FBI document. Michael agreed to meet, but when the journalist asked him what he had seen, Michael said only that it was a long time ago and that he did not remember the details. The journalist pressed him. Michael stood up, thanked him for his time, and left. He died 6 months later, at the age of 72. His wife found a business card in his wallet, yellowed and folded, with a phone number that had been disconnected decades earlier. The house on Tunlaw Road still stands. It has been sold several times since Richard Kowalski lived there. The current owners are a young couple who work in tech and have no idea that their home was once part of a system that spanned an entire city, an entire ideology, an entire era. The walls have been repainted, the basement has been finished, the cables are gone. But the memory remains, buried in classified files that will not be fully declassified for another 20 years, and in the minds of the few people still alive who know what was found there and what it meant. The Cold War was fought in many places, but its deepest battles were fought in silence, in the space between what was said and what was heard, in the walls of ordinary homes where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, never knowing that they were being studied, catalogued, and used. The weapons were not nuclear. They were microphones, cables, and the patient work of men and women who understood that power comes not from what you can destroy, but from what you know. And the casualties were not soldiers. They were plumbers, analysts, and families who trusted that their walls were just walls. There are no monuments to these battles. There are no names carved in stone. There is only the quiet understanding, shared by those who lived through it, that the war never really ended. It simply changed shape. The technology improved, the methods evolved. But the fundamental truth remained. Someone is always listening. Someone is always watching. And the price of security is the surrender of the belief that you are ever truly alone. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile privacy really was and how much we take for granted the walls that surround us, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten. Stories of people who stumbled into history and paid the price for seeing too much. Because the past is not dead. It is not even past. It is recorded, filed, and waiting in archives that will one day be opened, revealing the truth that those who lived it were never allowed to speak.